Today, my husband Dave and myself will be talking about Judy and Dave's prison adventure. Over the past year, we have visited 8 of the 32 California state prisons and wanted to share something of our journey along the way of what we've learned. Prior to this time period, we didn't know very much about jails or prisons. Our knowledge was informed by watching the Andy Griffith show as kids, taking the boat over to Alcatraz, watching Shawshank Redemption, noticing those signs along some California highways that tell you there's a state prison coming up, don't pick up any hitchhikers. We're pretty much uninformed, out of touch, and oblivious. It was really prisons, out of sight, out of mind. We have a member of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. His name is Johnny Mora. He's been a member since March of 2022, and he started writing us letters since about March of that year. He writes to us about his life, his hopes, his fears, and every month we send him our newsletter and other humanist-related publications. He's in his early 50s. He's been incarcerated for over 25 years, and this got me wondering about prison life and curious and interested about it. Johnny sent us this picture of himself. He wanted to make sure that we knew that, yes, he's a humanist, he's an atheist. You can tell by looking at his neck tattoos. So that interest in what's going on with Johnny, that interest in prisons led to talking to the Southern California Secular Coalition. HSSB is a member of that coalition. They were looking for a theme for their 2022 conference, and I suggested, what about looking at life behind bars, compassion and reform? Let's put together a day-long program on that. Dave?
Just as introduction, I'm Dave Flatter. I'm the treasurer of the Humanist Society, and I have been Judy's partner, as you can tell from the title, in these prison adventures, and have done some of my own work to try and understand the data behind prisons. Sort of how do we look at the landscape of prisons and make comparisons, and what can we learn from that? So I'll share a little bit about that, sort of the background around prisons. And the main metric that we use to look at prisons in societies is incarceration rate, which is the number of people incarcerated per 100,000 of the population. So this graph is the 11 most populous countries. I have the world on there too, so that took up a slot. So instead of 12, it's 11. And you can see the US is on there. That's this dark red line, and it's clearly very displaced from the global average and from the other countries on this list. And we'll dig into that a lot more in the next few slides. There's a global number on here, which is the bold black line. That's the overall global. How much does it, in terms of Earth, at what rate do we incarcerate people? And it's been growing. It's, statistically significant, but it's very slowly growing. But you can see there's some big changes in countries, right? Things change in countries, and incarceration rate seems to be one of the responses. Russia's incarceration rate has gone about in half since 2000. Brazil's has tripled, and Indonesia's has actually quadrupled. And so those are some of the lines that are real slanty on here, are those countries. And then you have, as you'll see in the next couple slides, a lot of countries down here in the 0 to 200 range, which is, normal is the right word, but it's typical. So who has the highest incarceration rates? Those were just, the top 11 countries by population, but the top 25 countries with population over 1 million, so mid-sized to large countries, are here. El Salvador, actually just recently, just in the last year or so, had a very big increase in the reported incarceration rate, and they have the highest incarceration rate. U.S. is 5th right now in the world in terms of the highest incarceration rate. And interestingly, I wouldn't have expected, when we look at it regionally, where are these top 25 countries? Almost half of them are in the Americas. South America, Central America, and of course, U.S. and North America. There are 6 in Asia, none in East Asia, but in Western, Central, and Southeast Asia. In Africa, there are 5 of them that are highlighted on there. And then in Europe, there are just 2. They're both in Eastern Europe, and it's Russia and Belarus. Certainly not in Western, Northern, or Southern Europe. A lot of those countries seem a lot different than the US. So one way I attempted to look at what's our incarceration rate compared to who should be our peer countries. And I did that with Human Development Index, which is a very widely used index published by the UN. People talk about the developing world. It's countries with a low Human Development Index from the UN. And it's made up of income, life expectancy, and educational attainment. So I call it the Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Index. But it looks at the overall development and prosperity sort of a society. And so when I plot all the countries with a Human Development Index over 0.85, which is in the highly developed range, and plot them at the intersection of their Human Development Index and their incarceration rate, they all fall into a pretty, expected kind of group in a similar range, with one exception, and that exception is the US. So the US incarceration rate is way outside of the 99% confidence interval, where we would expect, there's only a 1% chance that a country that belonged to this group would be outside of this interval. We're like a 10-foot tall person. Something's different that's making us very high. And it isn't all that hard to find out at least a clue about what that involves. And that is when we take the data for incarceration rate, and data are published by race and ethnicity also, and we look at Black Americans versus white Americans, the white Americans' incarceration rate ends up right in the middle of that cluster, just like the rest of the developed world that we consider our peers. But the Black Americans' incarceration rate is extremely elevated. It's higher than any. So there is something going on, and it's more complex, I think, than just racism, but there's something going on that's systematic and built in that's disadvantaging Black Americans in terms of the likelihood that they're going to be incarcerated. And it's not just an American phenomenon. The countries that publish both racial segmentation for subgroups in their countries, along with their incarceration data, where I can make the comparison, here are 4 countries, and in each one of them, there's a disadvantaged racial subgroup with a very significantly elevated incarceration rate. And that inequity is observed even when the disadvantaged subgroup is the majority. And we can see that across states as well. The graph on the right is the states ranked in order in terms of the ratio of the incarceration rate for their Black populace versus their white populace. So a very similar range that we see globally, we can see even just among the states. It hasn't always been like this. Data that are reliable enough to really calculate incarceration rates are kind of hard to find the farther back in time you go. But there have been some studies that publish a defensible data set that spans from 1940 to 2020. And when you look at it, up until mid-70s or so, we had an incarceration rate in the US that's very much in line with what the developed world experiences today. And then things changed, and incarceration rate skyrocketed, a little over quadrupled from where it used to be. And we have what's now been retroactively labeled as mass incarceration phenomena. There are a number of things that people cite, things like the war on drugs, 3 strikes laws, changes in sentencing laws making things mandatory, the absence of mental health services, prison industrial complex, fiscal interests, the list goes on. But there are many different things that seem to come together in this era, and it's starting to ebb. So you can see we peaked. Our incarceration rate is decreasing, and it's been doing that for over 10 years. So as we have been going to prisons, we've certainly, for me, it was something I just didn't understand or know about, but there is a web of infrastructure, a whole ecosystem of companies that have grown up around our incarceration system, have profited a lot from mass incarceration, and maybe some inertia that's good to be aware of if we're trying to recover from that. But information systems, phone calls, even databases, there's a significant private prison industry in the US. And the last one here is one that I found interesting. Texas has a fan direct program where they have a process for incarcerated people to purchase fans from Texas because so many of their prisons aren't air conditioned. Our states span this almost identical range of the 25 highest incarceration rate countries. And these are current data after the decrease I mentioned. On this graph, there are 2 lines, one for prison, one for jails. just for the vocabulary distinctions, jails are local facilities, city or county, generally short term, where people are during their trial until they're sentenced. Prisons, state and federal institutions, longer term, and post-conviction. The definition of incarceration rate, jails plus prison. So how well are they working? So they do publish a recidivism report that looks at what has happened to the population that was released 3 years ago over the last 3 years. So the data that are plotted here are the fraction of the released population that returns to prison within 3 years of their release date by release date. So for the people released in 2003, almost 70% of them returned to prison within 3 years. That has decreased a lot in the last few years, and now it's just under 20%. And when does it happen? It happens, for the most part, within the first year after you've been released. My conclusion from this is that however the processes work right now for rehabilitation and reentry and release, I don't believe these are the intended results. So the programs make an impact. State reports broadly on these in 3 categories: cognitive behavioral programs, technical trade programs, and educational programs. And in all of them, the competence intervals are there. If they did anything cognitive behavioral, they did anger management, criminal thinking, family, substance abuse things, similarly broken down for the other categories. And in general, any of those makes a difference. It corresponds with a reduced risk of being convicted within the first 3 years post-release. So where are these prisons? Well, they're mostly in the Central Valley section. There are a few in Northern California. There are a few in the desert in the south and southeast part of California. There are a few on the outskirts of LA, but for the most part, they're in the middle part of the state. There are 32 of them. There's one scheduled to close in March next year. 96% of the people incarcerated there are men, and it's about 116% of design capacity is the current prison population. We've been to 8 of them, the ones that are in red. So a couple other things about this landscape of incarceration, particularly in California. One is that there are significant changes, efforts, and work being done to shift the model of incarceration to what's called the California model, which is a more rehabilitative focused model. A lot of learnings taken from Scandinavia to install into California prisons the kind of best practices that lead to better outcomes while incarcerated, and in particular after having been incarcerated. So it's an opening for work to be done in prison on improving the system. And one of the things that we certainly see all the time when we visit is the introduction of tablets. So these special tablets, and it's part of the whole prison industrial complex, the people that make the tablets and write the software and charge the texting fees and all that. But it really is, I think, something that is impactful and that makes connection back to the community, back to the family, much more routine and accessible for people that are incarcerated that have tablets. They can take courses from it. It's sort of a portal to help them connect to the world and work on things that are valuable for them to work on before they return. And it's done in a way that CDCR is comfortable with safety and security. So there's a whole bunch of sort of observations, and those observations, I think, inform a lot of the context we have for the work we do in prison. Mass incarceration, my conclusion is it's unnecessary, expensive, and not very effective. There remains very profound racial disparity in how incarceration is applied, certainly at least as it turns out. Post-release conviction and return to prison rate is very much elevated compared to the rest of the population. And from talking to them, the California prison residents are noticing the difference. So that's the background that is going on as we started our last year going to prisons. I'll turn it over to Judy.
So there are other voices that have informed our view. We mentioned Johnny Mora and how that led to the development of the conference that we did in November 2022 that I think many of you have attended. There were other mileposts along the way. In 2020, we had noticed that was when the George Floyd killing happened, and it came after a number of very high-profile police killings, and we had then invited a speaker to come talk to us from the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And this message was, and their mission is to unite and mobilize the voice of law enforcement in support of drug policy and criminal justice reform, promoting alternatives to arrest and incarceration by addressing the root cause of crime, ending the war on drugs, looking beyond the criminal justice system for a range of solutions to address society's ills and better protect human rights, reduce violence, reduce addiction, and build public respect and trust in law enforcement. Also, at that time, I was invited to do an interview on a local radio station, October 21st, 2020. And to get ready for it, I listened to the same program the week before. And they were interviewing Dr. Bonnie Paul, who's a Santa Barbara resident with this Freedom to Choose project. They go inside prisons and do prison programming. And so that was another kind of brick in the wall of me starting to pay attention in this area of prisons and prison reform. Also at that time, one of the most highly respected prison law experts in the nation, Sharon Dolovich, which says that she wants to shift the approach for training lawyers from a front-end approach where they focus on investigation, prosecution, and verdict to a holistic one that encompasses the back-end criminal punishment. And her quote is, "I want every future lawyer who comes to law school to know prisons are something they should care about." Just wanted to mention that in Sharon Dolovich's class, she talks a little bit about the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment, it abolished slavery, but neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The other amendment they talk about in prison law, of course, spending most of the time on the 8th Amendment to the Constitution, which says excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments. And Michael Golding, speaking as a private citizen, volunteers make a difference. The programs that come into the prisons make a difference on an individual basis. And he said, and it's safe to go in there. You're going to be safer there than you are, walking down the streets of Santa Barbara. The U.S. is adopting some of these Scandinavian principles of humanity in the design of their prisons. And one of those prisons is called Little Scandinavia in Chester, Pennsylvania. Fritzie Horstman from Compassion Prison Projects. This is one of the programs that we ended up volunteering with. Very impressed by what their group does in looking at the effect and the impact of childhood trauma on the development of a child's brain and the way they respond to different circumstances in life. Dr. Andy Thompson is a psychiatrist talking about also the impact of trauma. Freedom to Choose spoke about the impact that Freedom to Choose had, which has been around for about 20 years. Some of the commitments that fit in very nicely with this work is the one on peace and social justice. It says, "I will help people solve problems and handle disagreements in ways that are fair for everyone." Service and participation. "I will help my community in ways that let me get to know the people I'm helping." And empathy. "I will consider other people's thoughts, feelings, and experiences." So let's get to talk a little bit about our actual volunteer work in prison with the Compassion Prison Project and the Freedom to Choose Project. We heard a lot about these adverse childhood experiences and the impact on the developing brain and in the way then that you react to different stress and circumstances as a teenager and as an adult. 10 specific traumatic childhood experiences are linked to a higher likelihood of health challenges, likelihood increases of having those challenges with the number of these ACEs that you have as a child experiences, and incarcerated people have much, much higher ACE scores than the general population. The 10 ACEs were defined as the following types of experiences: physical, sexual, verbal abuse, physical, emotional neglect, separation, divorce, abandonment, or death of a parent, a family member with mental illness or one who attempts or commits suicide, a family member addicted to drugs or alcohol, a family member who is in prison, witnessing a parent being abused. And all of these things fall into the ACE quiz. And ACEs can be used as a tool for building resilience, because trauma, once recognized, can be addressed through the neuroplasticity of the brain. For the incarcerated people, many of them apply. These are voluntary programs. So this isn't a statistically randomized sample of people who are incarcerated. These are the people who are actively working on addressing the behaviors that got them into the situation in the first place, actively addressing the issues so that they can be free again one day.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the moments labeled unforgettable moments, but they're sort of the significant moments where either we were impacted by it or we saw that it had a big impact on the participants. This one happened my first time doing the step inside the circle. And it was actually the first time I'd even taken the ACE quiz. And so as she's going through them, I'm listening to them. And at the end of it, I didn't have any of them. And so I was standing out at the edges of the circle and all the participants were in the middle. And one of them called me out and said, hey, you're out there like you're a zero. Nobody's a zero. You should be braver or be honest and come on in here and acknowledge your aces. From my perspective, it was like, oh, I wish I had some aces. It's separating me from everybody. But I look honestly, I don't have them. And so he was convinced that in his experience of the world, there was not a way for somebody to grow up and not have any aces. It's just not in his universe that could be true. He and I, as it turned out, we were doing one exercise where we're talking to each other about, it came up that my dad had plenty of aces. His alcoholic father committed suicide and basically abandoned by his mother. And, he had lots of aces, but it stopped. He stopped it. And, what makes that powerful, I think, in the prison is that the presence is for the people participating, that it can stop. It's a chance I always have to acknowledge my dad for that.
After they do the trauma circle, it could get a little heavy, just like Dave looking at this situation. And so what Fritzy does is she lightens the mood by leading us all in this playful call and response song and dance. So it's not all heavy. There's some fun in the day as well. But then we get to work learning about the impact of trauma on a child's brain development, and more importantly, learning skills and techniques to self-regulate and to heal.
One thing that's true is that they're always correctional officers, COs. On occasion, they participate, and absolutely, invariably, they are in the same range of trauma in terms of how many ACEs they have as the incarcerated participant. I didn't expect that. And at the women's prison, the lieutenant participated in several of the exercises. And as she was talking about it, she said, yeah, in my family, half the people are incarcerated and the other half are in law enforcement. It seems that they both may be responses to trauma. So prison can be this crazy world where you have a bunch of traumatized people on both sides of it, traumatizing each other while they're there.
Fritzy gives us an opportunity to take a microphone and introduce ourselves and let people know who we are and how we got involved with this work. And one of the things that I notice when they are talking about what happened to them as a kid, when Fritzy's talking about what 2-year-old deserves to be hit or slapped, I think about our grandson and I look around the room and I can imagine these men as 2-year-olds, as precocious little cute as a button 2-year-old. And I think about that they were somebody's grandson. And one thing to know in prison is that there's a pecking order, there's a hierarchy, and the people at the very bottom of the pecking order is anyone who's ever harmed a child. And so you don't want people to know that that's what you did. And what this gentleman shared, haltingly and very remorsefully, is that the crime that he was in for was that he had an 18-month-old son, and one day the son was crying and screaming and he couldn't control it and he was angry and he thumped him on his chest, I think are the words he used, and the baby died. And he was inconsolable. And I also was really struck by his courage to share this horrifying moment that he said he can never get over. Unforgettable moment, 17 to 71. This was my first or second time visiting and talking to a gentleman who told me that he has been incarcerated since he was 17 years old for a crime he committed earlier as a teenager, and he was currently 71 years old, and that he'd been in prison all that time and that he wasn't the same person he was at 17. And made me think, well, what is the worst thing I've ever done? And imagine being defined by that thing in your past for the rest of your life, regardless of the circumstances at the time, regardless of your growth and development since then, regardless of any amends you may have made or your future potential. So it feels like I'm getting such a gift in being let into kind of the privacy of their world, and that just by listening can make a difference. Thing that I've noticed at the work with Compassion Prison Project and with Freedom to Choose is that it kind of shifts the way I think about things from bad people hurt people to no, hurt people, and healed people can heal people. Another one is shifting from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and shifting from prisons as places that traumatize the already traumatized to a glimmer of hope, perhaps, that prisons can be centers of healing and transformation. And a sense of shifting from you are the problem, maybe you are the solution in terms of interrupting the cycle of recidivism, interrupting the generational transmission of trauma in the community, supporting and treating recovery from addiction, both inside and outside the communities. A little bit about Freedom to Choose. We haven't worked with them as much as with Compassion Prison Project. We've been on one of their visits, but it happened to be their 20th anniversary visit to Valley State Prison. They're also about power of redemption, power of second chances. They are basing their work on Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And the quote there is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. So if something happens, instead of automatically reacting, can you take a step back? Do you have tools to take a step back and consider what your response should be? What's different about Freedom to Choose is they have one volunteer for every 2 incarcerated people. So if they're having 200 incarcerated people come to a program, they have 100 or more volunteers. They're very impressive, very well organized, and they have this saying, we are so flexible, because going into prisons, it seems like the rules are always different. What you think it was supposed to be, it's going to be something different. Things change. You got to be flexible to keep moving forward. I would like to acknowledge some of the learnings that I've had in this journey from outside sources. I have to acknowledge my sister-in-law, Jennifer Flattery, who's here, who told me about this podcast, Ear Hustle. Please listen to Ear Hustle, find it. There's 100 episodes of it. It started being published in May 2017. Earlonne Woods and Nigel Poor lead this. Earlonne, this is in San Quentin Prison, first podcast ever created and produced from within a prison. Earlonne is now out, and it's just amazing. Ear hustle means eavesdropping in prison lingo, so that's where the name comes from. But highly recommend listening to Ear Hustle. Also, there are a number of books that I've read recently which were impactful. Until We Reckon by Danielle Sered, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. Her book's about restorative justice, an alternative to mass incarceration for violent offenders. Restorative justice, I'd always heard the term but didn't know what it meant. And what she talks about is there's another way if both the offender and the victim are willing to go through this process, that the offender can fully acknowledge responsibility over their action, can acknowledge the impact that their actions had on others, express genuine remorse. And the fourth step is doing sorry, meaning taking action to repair the harm, guided if possible by the people who are harmed by the action, and committing to no longer commit the same behavior. Also a book by Harvard professor Bruce Western called Homeward, about what factors have reentry into society be more or less successful. He looked at a group released from Massachusetts prisons in the Boston area. Body Keeps the Score, Boston-based psychiatrist, trauma researcher, and then finally Sparrow and the Razor Wire. This is Quan Huynh in the LA area, his personal story of his trauma growing up, his criminality, incarceration, those kind of moments of truth, turning points during his incarceration, acceptance, freedom, and then contributing to others. 4 books I would recommend. And then there's these great documentaries. The 50 is about a program at San Quentin in around 2006 where they took 50 lifers and started training them to be drug and alcohol counselors. And this program now has expanded to, I believe, all of the prisons in the California system. And they are sought after, and upon release are getting great jobs, making a huge difference. One of them said, "We are experts in the field when it comes to loneliness, hurt, and pain." if we had the right support, the right love and acknowledgement, the right education and therapy, we could ultimately become the greatest healers of our society. Ferguson Rises, wonderful movie. What I liked about that documentary, it talks about what happened at Ferguson with Michael Brown, and it looks at it from all different perspectives and see that everybody in all different perspectives are all human, all ultimately capable of growth and healing, and something to learn from them. Skid Row Marathon. This is LA Criminal Court Judge Craig Mitchell. And what he says in the movie is that he just kind of knows the same people kind of cycling through his court and thought, what else can he do? He was a runner. So he went down to Skid Row, started a running club with a group of unhoused and some formerly incarcerated people. They run international marathons, and just hearing some of their stories. The First Step, Van Jones, a journalist. During the Trump administration, he saw an opening to work across party lines on some landmark criminal justice reform legislation and humane responses to the addiction crisis, specifically in looking at the mandatory sentences for crack cocaine and powder cocaine are way different. Finally, 26.2 to life. You see, it was at the Santa Barbara Film Festival. That's another San Quentin program where a gentleman came in and started a 1,000-mile running club, and they have a marathon within the prison that is absolutely transformative. Tim, a number of us are working together to put on another conference, and the conference purpose is the title is Prisons to Partnerships, exploring what life is like for people in prison and after release, highlighting programs and initiatives that successfully prepare and support people in their rehabilitation and reintegration, offering opportunities to partner by promoting meaningful dialogues. There'll be more opportunities to talk, and inspiring people to support the programs that make a difference, reducing recidivism, promoting social justice, and transforming lives. And please share your learnings with others in your networks. And with that, I thank you all for attending this talk.